Alright everyone, it's time for a little bit more of a philosophical political video here. It's based on a tweet that I made the other day in a moment of clarity actually, that it seems to have hit a nerve with people who have Karl Marx avatars as well as people that are named like Odin Stormhammer 1488 and stuff like that. They seem incensed by the fact that I pointed out that all authoritarian systems, I know my horseshoe theory and you can post your smuggies and stuff, but the idea is authoritarian systems, by definition, in their authoritarianism, are left-leaning. There is no such thing as right-wing authoritarianism. If you have a system which is fundamentally economically laissez-faire, it's privatized, private property actually exists, it's not going to be a fully authoritarian system. That situation, the authoritarianism that would exist would not be on the front end of production. It would be on the end of actual buying things with the production that you've done. So you'd make your money, but you'd be limited maybe in what you can do with it, what you can say, and you can coordinate your communication with it. It's funny to see communists say, well, we're not opposed to personal property like computers and cars and stuff. We'll only need private property, something that has to do with production. I think you'll find that automobiles and computers both fall, therefore, under private property. Of course, if you're saying that you have the right to redistribute the means of production in a more fair capacity, as you would say, that would indicate that cars would definitely have to be on that list. Yeah, your work truck gets confiscated, replaced with a 70-year-old Volkswagen Beetle. Good luck getting to work in the wintertime. It's okay, you'll be starving anyway, so, work be damned. Authoritarian systems, though, if you have an authoritarian government, or I shouldn't say government, I should say an authoritarian structure, because you can have a theocracy in which you just got some priestly class making all the decisions. You can have essentially a non-government run by a single barbarian tyrant who rules by military force, and beyond that there could be no further organization, no legislative system, parliament, anything we would recognize as a modern government. You could have an oligarchic system, sort of like a technocratic council or anything. You have a robot run your country. Technically speaking, a bunch of computers could do the job. They'd probably do it better than many politicians, I hate to say. It's very sad. This government will inherently be far left. And I'll tell you why. And authoritarianism exists on a gradient. I'm not saying, well, some of these people were saying that I was conflating different forms of government with communism. Communism is just one authoritarian type of government, and it is inevitably authoritarian. When people say they're libertarian socialists, they have flown the coop. They're just mashing words together to make it sound more palatable. It's sort of like democratic socialism. Well, Venezuela is a democratic socialist nation. Maduro was duly elected, but they don't want you to understand that. The reason why it will be authoritarian is because even if you have privatization, it's privatization in name only. The government has the ability, whether it uses it or not. The same as a fully functioning authoritarian system. A fully functioning, self-admittedly tyrannical system may not purge elements of the population, may choose to leave certain property alone. The fact that it is authoritarian even in outward expression and self-admittedly doesn't mean that it necessarily at all times abuses the population. What makes it authoritarian is its ability to do so. It's not constrained. So a government could fall into this form. Say you have an authoritarian government, but it understands economics. So it says, like China. China's a great example. In the Chinese state, you have a hyper-privatized aspect to parts of the economy. There's certain industries in China, they face virtually zero regulation. There's no set working hour restrictions, no environmental restrictions. There's no restrictions on wages. There's no restrictions on work. There's no workers' rights to speak of. Not that anyone in China has rights to begin with. It is extremely laissez-faire on paper. The problem is it's not actually laissez-faire. You're not owning the means of production. The people that manage those businesses in China are only allowed to do so so long as they fall under the very authoritarian regimentation of ideology. If they step out of line, they lose their business because it's not theirs. The government at all times has the full unilateral dictatorial power to nationalize that business. In order for property, the means of production in the industrial sense, commercial sense, your farm, your home, you can grow things on your front lawn, which is why that wouldn't be personal property. When communists say, well, you can still have a house. No. It's not your house. It's the government's house. The government will also tell you what crops you're allowed to put in your little home garden, by the way. The government, though, has full control over it, so it's not private property. It's public property. It's collectively owned. It is communism. It's just communism that has a little bit more of an understanding of modern economics and how to structure itself in order to provide growth. But it doesn't mean that any of those people are at liberty to do what they want. They cannot say or believe the things that they want. They will be essentially handpicked by the government to run those businesses based on what properly would be a meritocratic function, but really it's a political function. It rewards party insiders. We've seen this time and time again. The government of China is far left. When people say, well, it's actually state capitalism, so it's far right. No, it's not. The government controls it 100%. By the way, the government of China has a negative return on its own infrastructural projects that it's paying for by grifting off the top that supposedly private income, by going after the shaving off, by fleecing China. The fleecing of China will be the next series probably. When you think of fascism, they say, well, fascism is a far-right ideology. It was hyper-industrialized and hyper-capitalistic. Again, in name only. If you pissed Mussolini off, did you still run the factory? Or did Mussolini have you killed and replaced? Mussolini had you killed and replaced. There's a reason for that. It's not private property. It's not a form of libertarian government. The idea that because you are at will to produce, to choose your job, to accumulate wealth means nothing if the government can come in at any time based on its own authoritarian leanings in the social sense, through its censorship and so forth, and wipe it back out. It's not yours. It's not your cash. It's the government's cash that it's letting you play around with as long as you toe the line. But the whole thing is, you're towing the line because the government is authoritarian. And so it is economic leftism. It can't be considered fully privatized. The other aspect of capitalism is free trade. It's not just the ability to produce, it's also the ability of the nation and the people in general to trade more or less freely. Does this exist in an authoritarian system of government? No, the government can tariff it out of existence instantaneously. It doesn't matter that it doesn't do that. China doesn't tariff everything, but it's still an authoritarian government, and it's extremely far left. And some people were conflating what I was saying. What I am saying is that if it is an authoritarian government, it is far left. I'm not saying that left-leaning aspects of government are necessarily full-on authoritarian. There are left-leaning governments that are less so, because if it's more socially permissive, and if it is constrained, you could have a constitution on a fundamentally left-leaning nation. You could have a welfare state, sort of like you'd have like a Nordic model state. It leans left in some economic fashions, although it has actual capitalistic underpinnings. That being said, it's not so authoritarian. What people can do with the wealth that they're actually allowed to have, and that, of course, to me is a more pure libertarian, is more problematic. That aspect is less authoritarian. You can't think of it as, well, this is an authoritarian government or it's a libertarian government. No government is on either end. There's no such thing as a truly anarcho-capitalistic society, and there can't be because it would spontaneously generate higher levels of order. In fact, they would tend to be among the most authoritarian and corrupt. As soon as there was a single problem, that society would begin to collapse. There can't be a fully authoritarian society because there's always at least one empowered group that has liberty and latitude. It's just a matter of how much liberty is granted to what scope of the population. In a libertarian society, in the proper way, if you had if you could approach a perfect libertarian society, here's the form it would take. It would be a society in which the government is seen as not much more than a night watchman state. It maintains courts to prevent internal victimization, and police attendant to that, and it maintains a military to prevent external victimization. Other functions generally would fall under one of those two umbrellas. The idea of having 1 million pages of environmental legislation is much more legalistic, bureaucratic, and authoritarian than simply saying people have a right to drink water out of the river and expect that there's not toxic waste in it, and they can use the courts to sue a business that has violated the NAP in so doing. That's what the proper state be. Now, can we actually achieve this? No. It's utopian. Like all forms of government, there's a utopian, idealistic version, and then there's the one you actually end up getting. The closest thing you can have to a properly understood anarcho-capitalist or even monarchist society is a fairly hardline classical liberalism with an expanded constitution. A state that is 99% privatized. But the government will need the power to step in at times simply for pragmatic reasons to prevent the society from collapsing, to prevent it from, through its disorganization, upending, and being replaced with one that's more authoritarian. Inevitably, by the way. Including if you end up with an ANCAP society, we saw this. There was a time, for a very short period, when anarchists controlled part of Spain. What happened? They ended up getting wiped out by Franco and by a bunch of communists that kept squabbling with them. For a while, the communists and anarchists got along together, because they sort of had similar goals, because they had a common enemy. Well, eventually, when the food started running short, the communists decided to start cannibalizing people, because then that's what severe authoritarians tend to do. The anarchists weren't very pleased with that at the time. But authoritarian systems can't be considered capitalistic. You can't have privatization in an authoritarian system. The government will have the authority to take away that supposed private property, because it's not yours, it's not private. I would argue that this is also violated. I would argue that in any state in the United States, which has a semi-liberal model, it's part authoritarian, there are libertarian underpinnings, you do have a constitution, sometimes it works, sometimes, unfortunately, it doesn't protect us for long periods of time. See Cruikshank decision, which thankfully was overturned. In a state where you have a property tax, you don't have capitalism. You don't own your home, you're renting it from the government. There are states with no property tax. That's, by the way, it should be nationwide. There shouldn't be a property tax anyway. It should be deemed unconstitutional. Kind of violates equal protection when you think about it. One person can't really own property, the other person can. I would say that at least under homesteading, the idea of a homestead, a certain amount of land and your first home up to a certain value should be constitutionally guaranteed exempt from property taxes. Just my opinion as maybe a pragmatic libertarian. I'm not saying Bill Gates should be able to buy up an entire city and never pay any taxes on his holdings. Of course, that would be very libertarian in name, but it's utopian nonsense. It's not pragmatic, can't work, and would result in anarchy. It would result in a revolution. The commies would try to take over. So when communists say, well, I'm a libertarian communist or a libertarian socialist. No, you're not. Explicitly, you're not. You're saying the government has the right to rob an indefinite proportion of the production, usually through the regulatory system, the right to confiscate it, that you have a right to others' productivity and in some cases, they argue, to their property. That can't be seen as anything other than authoritarian. And it doesn't matter the form of government. There's another thing. Some people, this isn't a mistake that leftists tend to make. This is actually a mistake liberals tend to make. People who are in the main line of society. They think that, like if you had a dictatorship, that's authoritarian, and if you have a democracy, that's very pro-freedom. Not necessarily. The democracy, you could have 51% of the population vote to kill the other 49% properly. You could also have a dictator who technically has total power but doesn't use it and just sits there. Doesn't do anything. Says, yeah, fuck, you can do whatever you want. Now, I'm not even gonna tax you. You fucking send me some fruit from your garden and I'll be eating high on the hog. A dictator could do that. You could have an authoritarian democracy. In fact, you've had many of them throughout time. They tend to become authoritarian over time. You can have a very laissez-faire dictatorship. You don't tend to. Usually the dictator gets power mad and paranoid because that's the human tendency is to be corrupted by wealth and power and prestige. It's unfortunate. That's why it's better to have a government that's like a republican system that changes over time. People get booted back out. We should have term limits for Congress for this reason. But yeah, there's just some thoughts here on authoritarianism. They cannot be right-wing. No, fascism is not a right-wing ideology. And yes, the Nazis were socialists. Absolutely. They were socialist in more than just name. When a government has the unilateral authority, you think about this. They say, well, the Nazis were very capitalistic and right-leaning. Oh, really? Well, I seem to recall them attacking, burning, and nationalizing thousands of storefronts because a certain ethnicity of people happened to own them. Very, very private property that was when it was getting attacked by people who were rioting at the time, and later on by the brown shirts, of course. That's not a right-wing ideology. That's one that leans to the left. Again, there is a gradient of authoritarianism. The authoritarian government can say, well, we've got privatization, we've got a market economy, but it's only for people that the government allows to partake in it. That's authoritarian. It's also left-leaning, because it's not your property. It's only your property in name. It'd be like if the government said, well, yeah, everyone has the right to have a free computer, but if you say the wrong things on it, we're shutting off your internet and taking it back. Well, they wouldn't. That's authoritarian, dude. It wouldn't be a libertarian move. Oh, well, everyone gets the right to communicate in these platforms as long as you say what the government tells you you're allowed to say. That's about all. Peace out.